Henry VII ruled England for almost a quarter century, from 1485 to 1509. During his reign, the civil wars that had convulsed the country for much of the 15th century burned themselves out. By its end, he had laid the foundations for the dynasty that bore his name, Tudor. He was a man with a highly dubious claim to the throne, who seized power and passed it on in the first untroubled succession in almost a century. Yet, wedged between two of the most notorious monarchs in English history, the arch-villain Richard III and the massive figure of Henry VIII, Henry VII remains mysterious. Or as his first biographer, the 17th century political thinker Francis Bacon put it, a dark prince. In English history, Henry VII's reign is still widely understood as a time of transition, one in which the violent feuds of the previous decades gave way to a glorious age of Renaissance and Reformation. This was the myth that the Tudors themselves built. The later Tudors referred to Henry VII as we now see him, the unifier of a war-torn land, a wise king who brought justice and stability, and who set the crown on a sound financial footing. Nonetheless, they were unable to eradicate the lingering sense of a reign that degenerated into oppression, extortion, and a kind of terror, at its core an avaricious Machiavellian king who inspired not love but fear. In calling him a dark prince, Bacon's emphasis was on the sinister as well as the opaque. Henry VII, he wrote, was infinitely suspicious, and he was right to be so, for his times were full of secret conspiracies and troubles. Perhaps the most telling verdict of all is that of Shakespeare, who omits Henry VII altogether from his sequence of history plays, and not for want of material, but, one suspects, because the reign was simply too uncomfortable to deal with. Merely scratching the surface of Henry VII's reign exposes troubling questions about his right to the crown, and about the way he held on to it. From the very outset, Henry faced challenges to his rule. Unable to eradicate the taint of illegitimacy that hung around his throne, or to master a world in which the compromised loyalties and political traumas of civil war persisted, he constructed around himself a regime whose magnificence concealed the fact that it was contingent, temporary, a sustained state of emergency. And 15 years into his reign, just when he thought that he had laid his demons to rest, a family catastrophe left him newly vulnerable, wrenching the dynasty off the course that he had planned for it, and setting it on a new and unexpected direction, his hopes resting no longer on his firstborn son, but entirely on his second, the boy who would eventually succeed him as Henry VIII. Unsurprisingly, when the 17-year-old Henry VIII inherited the throne in the spring of 1509, he had a difficult circle to square. His coronation was accompanied by an outpouring of praise which presented him as his father's successor, while at the same time distancing him from the disturbing years that had just passed. Court poets reached for Plato's tried and tested idea of the Golden Age, paradise, the first of epochs which, like the seasons, would return. This glorious young prince represented a metaphorical spring, a second coming, seemingly as unlike his father as could be. It was a model that had been used before, in living memory, in fact. Back in 1485, Henry VII had evoked the Golden Age to define himself against the king he had defeated and called a usurper, Richard III. But in 1509, court poets portrayed Henry's own reign as a sterile landscape, one in which bears roamed and wolves howled, a time in which the natural order had been subverted, but which, mercifully, was rightfully restored in the shape of his son. In other words, if Henry VIII was the spring, his father was the winter. This is a gripping and largely untold story. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were a volatile time of change and possibility, and, like all periods of flux, its energy and vitality are seductive. The medieval worlds of chivalry and intense piety mingle with new political ideas, spread by the printing press and enforced by gunpowder. Dynasties and states struggle to be born in a war-torn Christendom that is still, in theory, unified by an unswerving obedience to the Pope. Fleets of merchant ships, their trade routes to the east blocked by the Ottoman Empire encroaching on Europe's southeastern frontier, sail west across the Atlantic and discover a new continent.